Hey, what's up guys? Chris Jr. here for Kriscoart. Today we're exploring 5 easy steps in creating some effective sound design for your next scene. So these are kind of like the absolute basics, and I wanted to kind of lay out a basic structure that maybe you guys can also follow when you're adding sounds into your scene. So I've divided into 5 different steps, and the first one is simply just finding or recording those sounds. And I say finding because you can use different audio libraries, and this video is actually sponsored by Audioblocks, so you can use their audio library, which is great. So I really like the platform. They have a ton of sound effects, and it's nice how they're split into categories, and you can just search whatever you want and hover over the sounds to preview them, and then you can just simply download them with one click. So I like how simple and easy that is. Especially when you're trying to gather a ton of sounds, this can save you a lot of time. And there is plenty to pick from because they have over 100,000 audio tracks. Or you can record your own sounds. And this is a little bit more time consuming and a little bit trickier, but sometimes if you absolutely need to nail certain movements, this might be the way to go. So this is what Foley is, and there are Foley artists that their job in a movie is to recreate sounds in a studio that can match the visuals that they're seeing projected on a screen. And if done well, these sounds and the sound design needs to be invisible to the audience. So it just needs to fit the scene, it needs to make sense for what they're looking at, but if it stands out, it's just kind of like bad editing. So much like that, a sound designer needs to introduce different sounds and ideas that can serve the visuals and the story. So now that we've found the sounds or recorded the sounds, or we have them all ready for what we need, it's time to lay them out in our timeline. Now I really recommend laying out your sounds in Premiere, whatever editing software you're using, and then dynamic linking them or exporting those sounds and fine-tuning and editing them and adding effects and processing them in a separate tool or software that is dedicated to sound. So in my case, a lot of the times I will lay out my sounds in Premiere just to kind of get a visual reference and matching them up and lining them up. And then once I'm happy with the overall structure, then I'll dynamic link those sounds into Adobe Audition. And then from there, I'll tweak them a little bit further, add some effects, and really polish them off, because Adobe Audition is meant for sound, so it has a ton more options than what Premiere could offer. Although they did update it recently and they got rid of a bunch of legacy old kind of really outdated audio effects in Premiere, and they've updated them to some really solid ones. So it is feasible to actually stay within Premiere and get a really good sounding mix right inside of Premiere without leaving the software. So that's actually what I have to do a lot of the times if I'm running into some tighter deadlines. So once we feel pretty confident with what we have in our timeline, it's always good to maybe just take a step back from it, take a break. Detaching yourself from your work for a little bit can help you see certain things that you weren't seeing before, or even come up with new ideas. And I definitely think that that is the case with sound design. Take a breather, take a break, and then come back to the timeline with the sounds that you've laid out. And now it's time to revisit it and add color and add detail. So what I mean by color is not actual color, it's just kind of enriching some of the sounds. But yeah, by adding some detail here and there and just filling some of those gaps a little bit more. And speaking of gaps, silence can be a really powerful tool when sound designing, and it can really add emphasis to certain moments, or it can really further the tone or the mood that you're trying to convey. So keep that in mind. You don't always have to pump out to the max dB and just be super loud all the time. Sometimes you can have moments where it dips down and then you can pick it back up. And again, it all depends on the type of scene that you're dealing with. But also keep in mind that when we're talking about silence, we're not talking about complete silence. There's always going to be something there in your timeline. So if you're in a room like this, there's going to be room tone. There is going to be the AC that I forgot to turn off in the background. There's going to be some birds from outside, some cars passing by in the background. And if you're even in a completely acoustically treated room, you can actually hear your own blood pumping through your veins, which is, yeah, I don't want to think about that. That's kind of really uncomfortable. But the point is, there's always going to be a certain sound, even when there's complete silence. So keep that in mind when you're sound designing your silence into your sound design. All right, so we've done all of that. We have everything laid out perfectly. We have all our detail, and we're feeling pretty happy with it. So now it's time to actually balance all the sound. And the important part about balancing sound is not just, making sure that the music dips down to allow certain sounds to kick in a little bit harder, but it can actually happen within sounds themselves. Sometimes you can layer multiple sounds to really sell a singular sound to the audience. So sometimes a punch sound isn't just a punch sound. it can actually be different layers of a bassier tone. So you can combine multiple sounds to convey a single sound. And it's in cases like this that you really have to balance all of those different layers to fit well with each other, because if you have different sounds that are overlaid with each other that have a bassier range in it and it's overlapping, it starts to kind of get muddy and it creates distortion. So you want to make sure that every layer that you're introducing can serve its own purpose and take up its own space without overwhelming any of the other sounds. Now you can play with the volume of the clips to make sure that the overall loudness of every layer matches with what you want, but then most importantly you want to equalize all of those layers so that you can have, maybe going back to the punching example, you can have the skin on skin contact to be more in the higher range of frequencies without taking up too much of the bassier side, which can be left open for that more bassy impact. So it can definitely get tricky, but with practice you can really start to see where certain sounds and certain layers of those sounds really need to fit. But balancing doesn't just happen within different layers of a single sound, it can also happen for your overall timeline. And this is where you can play with loudness and equalizing things overall to fit your scene and to fit where the sounds are being heard from. But the source through which we're hearing these things can change depending on your story. For example, you can have the source be the camera, so pretty much in your scene you are listening as if you were the camera. But the thing is, that can change, and sometimes the source through which we're hearing our scene cannot be the camera, but it could also be maybe our protagonist. If we're trying to really dial in certain emotions that that character is feeling, maybe we want things and sounds to be processed through the character's ears, and that's where we're hearing it from, and that brings it in a much more closer way, in a much more intimate way to what the character is feeling. You can really take that in all kinds of different directions, but keep that in mind when you're sound designing and you're structuring things around, and especially when you start balancing and making things louder or quieter or panning things from the left speaker to the right speaker. Definitely keep that in mind, because sometimes the source through which we're hearing these sounds in your scene can change depending on your story. All right, so we've done all of that, and now we are up to the final step, and that is fitting the sounds to the environment. And this is really important, and this is a step that is oftentimes overlooked in some of the shorts that I see online, and it can make a huge difference because different types of environment have a different acoustic quality. A room this size is going to have a different quality of sounds from even the same type of room but smaller. And that is because every object in this room is absorbing or reflecting back sound. So this final phase of this type of work can get really detailed and really precise, but I would recommend just doing at least a reverb pass if you're just starting off, and just making sure that you can get the reverb of the sounds that you're introducing to match as close as possible to either sounds that you already have in the scene or to what the sounds would sound like in that scene. So I'm going to show you an example real quick. Gun sound effects. These are probably the loudest type of sounds that we are familiar with in movies, you know, other than explosions and all that, but same principle. Essentially, you have a loud pop, and that is where reverb and all these other things that we talked about becomes more obvious. And that is why I think a lot of shorts and even a lot of movies get this wrong. That and punches for some reason. So let's just focus on the last step that we just talked about. If I were to fire this gun without any reverb, it would sound like this. Okay, so since we're in a room and it's a small room, this could still maybe kind of work, but obviously if we were in an open field, it would feel off because we're not hearing that reverb, we're not hearing that, that kind of the tail end of the gunshot. But even without going that extreme, let's stay within this room and let's see how this sound sounds with a little bit of reverb that's appropriate with this type of environment. A little bit better. So let's introduce some of the other things that we talked about, so we can maybe add some detail and some color. So that could be the actual Foley of the gun, or even the the bolt action and all the things, the mechanism that go on before the bullet is actually fired. So if you introduce those a little bit before, and then you introduce a little bit of the tail end of the sound with the reverb, now you get something like this. So you can see how just a few little details can even add to the realism of even some visual effects. So there's definitely a lot to talk about sound. It's its own realm and world, and there's so much to explore, and there's so many ways that you can use it and take advantage of it to really fit your story, to further it, and to really sell certain moments in your scene. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something from it, and if you did, leave a like, and I would like to thank again AudioBlocks for sponsoring this video and making this possible. So they're launching a campaign with the hashtag creator2creator. So if you guys want to create anything, you can actually use the link in the description below to get a 7-day free trial where you can just download a bunch of sounds and create something and share it with the hashtag creator2creator so you can get some extra little bit of exposure and be part of their campaign. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Chris for Kriscoart, and I'll see you next week.